Aloha ahi ahi, aloha mai kako. Thank you for joining us this evening. We will get started in a few minutes. Mahalo nui for your patience. We're really thrilled to see where some of you are viewing from: Ventura, California, Chicago to Honolulu. Are you in flight maybe? Pearl City, Honolulu. We've got some past presenters. Lorenzo, mahalo for joining us today. Eva Beach, couple from Kaneohe. Thank you from Mokuokeawe, aloha nui. Aloha to you all. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Iron out a few technical difficulties. We're really pleased to be bringing you Ho'ola Week, the intersection of Hawaiian history and Hawaiian health. Pa'alolo, a couple of you from Pa'alolo. Yeah, that's right. Thank you for sharing. We're glad you're all here. This is our second webinar for this week related to Hawaiian health. Last week, our colleagues with education had a great presentation, and next week is Hanakeaka Week, where we've got a play. And if you haven't already registered to see the Hanakeaka, which will be at Kennedy Theater at the UH campus Manoa, you can go online and register. All of these presentations will be archived on the Hawaiian History Month website at hawaiianhistorymonth.org. Pupukea, oh, fabulous. Yeah. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Aloha mai kako. My name is Kim Ku'ule Burney. I am happy to be your host for this Friday night presentation of Hawaiian History Month, Ho'ola. Welcome. This is a series that features the intersection of Hawaiian health and well-being through the lens of history. Hawaiian History Month is presented each year by Hawaii Pono'i Coalition. This is the fourth year, with the support of many fine sponsors and partners. Ho'ola Week is coordinated by Papu'ola Lokahi, the Department of Native Hawaiian Health at the John A. Burns School of Medicine, and Ahahuiona Koka, the Association of Native Hawaiian Physicians. And the first half of this presentation is going to be moderated by Dr. Martina Kamaka with Ahahuiona Koka. A couple of housekeeping items first. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be live streamed on several different platforms on YouTube and several different Facebook platforms. It will then be archived on the Hawaiian History Month website at hawaiianhistorymonth.org. So if your friends or relatives miss the presentation, it will be online shortly afterwards. And in fact, if you go to the website, you'll see many of the presentations that have been offered in previous years. Tonight's episode is extraordinary. It's entitled Kalaupapa, Memorializing the Past, Creating a Future, and it's presented in two parts. So to introduce our first presenter, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Martina Lealoha Kamaka, and she will introduce our first presenter.
Aloha kako, mahalo nui, Kim. I really appreciate that. I'm Martina Lealoha Kamaka, and I am honored to be one of the physicians that helps to take care of the patients from Kalaupapa and Halemohalu. There are actually three of us, a team of three of us that do a lot of this. Dr. Kalani Brady and Dr. Peter Donnelly are my colleagues in this, and I just want to put a little mahalo out to Dr. Alex Pishalenko and Dr. Chad Koyanagi, who also help us when we call on them. So I've been helping to take care of the patients since 2004. And like I said, it's been a real honor and a privilege for me to have been part of their lives for the last 20 years, and really exciting for me to see sort of what's happening for the patients and their legacy moving into the future. And that's where it's really wonderful for us tonight to hear from Valerie Manson. Valerie Manson is the founding member of Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa and currently serving as the executive director. So she's going to be our presenter for this evening. She's been interviewing and writing about the people of Kalaupapa for nearly 35 years. She first visited the settlement in around 1989 and has been a reporter for the Maui News. She now helps families learn about their Kalaupapa ancestors and is always on the lookout for descendants who want to get more involved with the programs of Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa. So I'm really honored to have Valerie join us tonight, and want to welcome you. And there you are. Make sure I can see you. Okay, Valerie, I'm going to hand it over to you. I know you have some wonderful things to share with us this evening.
Oh, mahalo, Martina. I'm going to get my slideshow up here. Okay. All right, I think we're ready to go. Aloha, and welcome to a very special webinar by Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa and Ahahui o Nakauka, where we remember the birthday of Queen Liliuokalani and her strong connections to Kalaupapa. We will be sharing some often forgotten chapters of the history of Kalaupapa, including all that the Queen did to make life better for people affected by leprosy. We thank you all for making time in your busy schedules to be with us this evening. And we thank Ahahui o Nakauka for this wonderful opportunity to collaborate, as well as everyone associated with Hawaiian History Month. Before we get started, we want to send our prayers and aloha to the people on Maui who have been devastated by the recent wildfires. Our hearts are with all of you, and we send you the best for healing, strength, and resiliency in the upcoming days, months, and years. Malama Lahaina, Malama Upcountry. And I want to especially thank Kim Burney of Ahahui o Nakauka, who is handling the technical end of this webinar. Kim, we couldn't do this without you, and a big mahalo to you. Okay. Sorry. Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa, organized in 2003 at the request of the Kalaupapa residents, with the purpose of reaching out to family members and friends to make sure the voices of Kalaupapa were always heard in telling this history and in shaping the future. Our three main goals are to advocate for the people of Kalaupapa, develop educational programs, and work in partnership to preserve the history. We are proud to say that this is our 20th anniversary. We feel this photograph of the Kalawao Choir of 1901 reflects our mission, showing the people of Kalaupapa in their Sunday best, proud members of their community. One thing before we begin, we believe that language is very important. As we all know, words carry the power to help people feel better about themselves. Words also carry the power to hurt, offend, and demoralize. Those of us with Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa use either leprosy or Hansen's disease to describe the disease, but we strongly object to use of the word leper. While Hawaiians created a word for leprosy, lepera or lepella, they did not create a word for leper. This was a word that came from the foreigners. Hawaiians very often described people affected by the disease as namai, people who are sick, or they used other descriptions that were respectful and emphasized people, not a disease. In addition, the word leper has come to mean all sorts of things that have nothing to do with the disease, but imply that the person is less than a human being. We believe this word should be eliminated from our language. Between 1866 and 1969, nearly 8,000 men, women, and children in Hawaii were taken from their families and forcibly isolated on the Kalaupapa Peninsula because of government policies regarding leprosy. 90% were Native Hawaiians. People arrived at Kalaupapa in rowboats that had been lowered from the ships that brought them from Honolulu. There is a myth that people were thrown overboard. This is a myth. It is not true. As you can see, landings at Kalaupapa were often difficult, but as far as we know, there never was a time when people were intentionally thrown overboard. Many people were writing about Kalaupapa in 1866 and in years after, and no one wrote about this kind of thing. This was a sensational piece of misinformation created later by Hollywood and novelists. Unfortunately, this myth persists. Most of the people of Kalaupapa who were sent to Kalaupapa usually were there for the rest of their lives. For much of this history, these individuals were described in negative ways and very often without individual identities. We still don't know the names of these two girls, but we are always hopeful that someday we will. People of all ages were sent to Kalaupapa, including children who were sent by themselves. The youngest child admitted to Kalaupapa was just 4 years old. Neither were the elderly spared. The oldest person sent to Kalaupapa was 105. This is the Makanalua Peninsula. For those of you who have visited Kalaupapa, this is probably a picture that stirs your heart. For those of you who have never been there, the original settlement of Kalawao, where the early people lived, is on the eastern side, the top left of the peninsula in this photo. Kalaupapa, where the community is today and has been for many years, is on the west. There are now 8 people who have the right to live at Kalaupapa. Those people who were taken from their families and isolated under the old laws. There are 4 people living there today. The number of them at Kalaupapa at any one time varies as people go back and forth to Honolulu for medical needs or other reasons. Their average age is 85 or older. To support the community and manage the land, there are also workers with the Department of Health and National Park Service at Kalaupapa. I'm sorry to say that 2 of these individuals have died since this photo was taken. Boogie Kahilihiva on the right, who died in 2021, and Robert Ho'opi'i, the man on the far left, who was born at Kalaupapa and lived most of his life on Oahu. When I made my first trip to Kalaupapa in 1989 as a reporter, I was told a very different history than what we know today. What I was being told back then, like what so many other people were being told, was based on information exclusively written in English. But because of the resurgence of the Hawaiian language, this has changed, and we now have become aware of numerous letters, documents, newspaper articles, church minutes, and other materials that were written in Olelo, Hawaii. These previously ignored resources show the people of Kalaupapa in their own words, in their own language, and in a much different light. This letter was written by J.N. Loy, one of the very first people sent to Kalaupapa. He wrote this letter in February of 1866, just 1 month after he arrived. He's asking that newspapers be sent to him at Kalaupapa. We want to thank the late state archivist Agnes Conrad for sharing some of these early letters from Kalaupapa, many of them forgotten, with our Ohana historian, Anwe Law. You see J.N. Loy's name as the second on this ledger. These were the names of the first 12 people who were sent to Kalaupapa on January 6, 1866. And as we said before, they were the first of nearly 8,000 people who would be forcibly isolated on this peninsula. When those first 12 people arrived at Kalaupapa, they were told they would be receiving health care, very much like what they had been receiving at Kalihi Hospital. So after they walked from the Kalaupapa landing to Kalawao, they expected to find a doctor or a hospital. However, they found no kind of medical help. What they did find were Kama'aina, Native Hawaiians who had been living on this land and along the north shore of Molokai for hundreds of years. The Board of Health had purchased some houses for the sick people, but the Kama'aina also took in others to look after them. It should also be noted that the healthier of the people affected by leprosy helped care for those among them who were less able. Already a sense of community. The Kama'aina, however, were not rewarded for their charity and kindness. And over the years, we're told they would have to leave the place where their families had lived for generations. Some of them left their homes for life elsewhere. Others did not leave until they were forced to go. In 1894, 1 year after the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, an edict went out that ordered all remaining Kama'aina to leave. At that time, there were still 39 Kama'aina living on the Kalaupapa side of the peninsula. All of them had left by the following January. So the story of Kalaupapa is one of two forced relocations. An unknown number of Kama'aina who had to leave the land where their families had lived for so very long, as well as the forced relocation of nearly 8,000 people who had been diagnosed with leprosy and were taken from their families, taken from their homes. The people who were sent to Kalaupapa began to show their resiliency almost immediately, despite the circumstances. In June of 1866, less than 6 months after the first 12 people were admitted to Kalaupapa, the congregation of Silawama Church was conceived when 23 men and 12 women were released from their home congregations to form a new church. For the next 5 years, they met on the lanai of one of their fellow worshipers. By 1871, the congregation had raised enough money to build a church with a bell. This shows how a number of people of Kalaupapa were determined to rebuild their lives through their love of God, love of each other, and love of community. I should point out that this picture is of Silawama after it was rebuilt around 1885. How do we make sure that this history remains a living history? How do we make sure the people live on in the hearts and minds of future generations? Bernard Punikaya was a champion of justice, one of the great leaders in the history of Kalaupapa, and the founder of Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa. Bernard was taken from his mother when he was just 6.5 years old and admitted to Kalihi Hospital. He was sent to Kalaupapa at the age of 11 in 1942 and would go on to become a human rights activist recognized around the world. In the mid-1990s, Bernard began to worry about the future of Kalaupapa and that it would be directed by outsiders instead of by the wishes of the people of Kalaupapa. It was his vision to bring together family members and friends to support the Kalaupapa residents and to carry on their legacies. Bernard's idea evolved into Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa. This was our longtime president, Boogie Kahilihiva. He is with a descendant of Kalaupapa, Momilani Motachik. They are leading an Ohana ceremony at the future site of the Kalaupapa Memorial. Boogie was taken from his family when he was just 9 years old. He was the fourth child his parents had to give up because of the disease. And yet Boogie, like so many others, rose above the injustices and suffering. As we noted earlier, Boogie died in 2021. He was just shy of his 80th birthday. This was an enormous loss for the community and for our Ohana. When Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa gathers at Kalaupapa, we have a ceremony at the future site of the memorial, where we speak aloud the names of family members and friends who have died there. It's always the most emotional part of our gatherings. Helping families learn more about their ancestors at Kalaupapa and getting to know them is one of the most rewarding parts of our mission. When the Ohana began in 2003, we had no idea we would be starting a movement of sorts. Through our Restoration of Family Ties program, Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa has now helped probably close to 900 descendants learn more about their Kalaupapa ancestors. These descendants are giving Kalaupapa a future. This is one of those stories. This is the Kalaupapa classroom in 1904. Look at these students and their well-dressed teacher. This could have been a classroom anywhere in Hawaii at that time. We knew about this photo for many years, but we did not know the identity of the teacher until 15 years ago, when I got a call from Anna Poe, the woman on the left, shown here with her daughter, Teresa. Anne asked if I knew of her great-grandfather named John Unea, who had been sent to Kalaupapa. I told her we knew John Unea had taken the first US Census at Kalaupapa in 1900. She then asked if we had a photo of him. I had to tell her no. But Anne excitedly replied that she had a picture of her great-grandfather, and she shared it with us. Isn't this an amazing portrait? It's not an image many would associate with Kalaupapa. In addition, our historian, Anwe Law, immediately recognized John Unea's face from somewhere else. It was the face of the school teacher, and he was wearing the same suit. So we could identify the teacher as John Unea. This is one of the things we love doing, putting names to faces and really getting to better know the community of Kalaupapa, even from many, many years ago. We later learned from Anne that before her great-grandfather was sent to Kalaupapa, he had been principal of Hakalau School near Hilo. So of course, he would have been an excellent choice to serve as teacher. We wanted to get a picture of Anne for an exhibit Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa was developing. We asked her to pose in front of Iolani Palace, and she said, "Can I bring some of my family?" This is the picture that resulted. We just love seeing all these descendants of John Unea together, all these different ages. Wouldn't he be proud? The reason we wanted Anne to have her picture taken in front of Iolani Palace was so we could also honor the role the Ali'i played at Kalaupapa. When King Kalakaua ascended the throne in 1874, he and Queen Kapiolani visited all the islands, including a stop at Kalaupapa, where they saw people who they knew, people they did not realize had been sent there. So the situation regarding those affected by leprosy became personal to the king and queen. In the early 1880s, they put out a request through the Catholic Church asking for Sisters of Mercy to care for the people who had the disease, feeling that there needed to be a more compassionate approach. Mother Mary Ann Cope of the Sisters of St. Francis in Syracuse, New York, was the only person to accept the invitation, arriving in Hawaii in 1883 with 6 other sisters. This photo is from a visit of Queen Kapiolani and then Princess Liliuokalani to the peninsula in 1884. We thank historian Colette Higgins for pointing out this photo and for all her research, particularly on Queen Kapiolani. The Queen visited every house on the peninsula as well as the hospital. She was escorted by Ambrose Hutcheson, an unsung hero of Kalaupapa. The Queen met with the community and asked what they most needed. When the Queen returned to Honolulu, she put into motion a number of important projects requested by the residents. Because of Queen Kapiolani, water pipes were laid that would provide fresh drinking water to Kalaupapa. Lumber arrived for much needed additional housing, and individual packages were sent to each person at Kalaupapa with a gift specifically chosen for that individual. The Queen also began plans for the Kapiolani Home for Girls on Oahu, so parents at Kalaupapa had the option of sending their healthy girls there so they would not contract the disease. Queen Kapiolani and King Kalakaua, like Queen Liliuokalani, took action to help the people who had been sent to Kalaupapa. Father Damien is probably the most well-known person in the history of Kalaupapa. He arrived in 1873 during a time of severe hardships and shortages. He was not only a priest, but a friend, a tireless worker, and an advocate for the people of Kalaupapa. He was also respected by the royal family. Here are some of the boys and young men with Father Damien in 1889. The last photo taken of Damien 2 months before his death. Please note the man to the right of Damien near the top of the photo with the mustache and beard. Here's a close-up of him. This is Ambrose Hutcheson, who we noted was an unsung hero of Kalaupapa. And we thank once again Anwe Law and Ambrose's family for identifying him in this photo. Ambrose was sent to Kalaupapa in 1879 and lived until 1932, 53 years at Kalaupapa. He was appointed as superintendent in 1884 at the young age of 27 and served in that position for a total of 10 years. He also worked closely with Father Damien for the last 10 years of Damien's life. As you can see, the settlement's resident physician, Dr. Arthur Moritz, greatly admired this young, capable leader. Ambrose left us a memoir of his life at Kalaupapa, which Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa has recently published into a beautiful book. In 1888, the Bishop Home was opened at Kalaupapa for single women and girls. Mother Mary Ann Cope and the Franciscan nuns made sure these women and girls were cared for. The Bishop Home became a refuge, a welcoming place of friendship and comfort, a constant presence that continued long after Mother Mary Ann's death in 1918. As we mentioned, Mother Mary Ann and 6 sisters arrived in Hawaii in November of 1883. Answering the call initiated by Queen Kapiolani and King Kalakaua. The sisters did not go to Kalaupapa at this time. For their first 5 years in Hawaii, they worked at Kaka'ako Branch Hospital in Honolulu, where people with leprosy were being treated. Queen Liliuokalani made more visits to Kalaupapa than any other ali'i. She traveled to Kalaupapa at least 3 times, in 1881, 1884, and 1891. Liliuokalani's initial trip in 1881 came when she was serving as Princess Regent, as her brother, King Kalakaua, was on his worldwide tour. According to a newspaper account in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, when Princess Liliuokalani landed, she saw familiar faces among the crowd and was so overcome with emotion that she could not speak. An attendant had to deliver her greetings for her. Seeing friends at Kalaupapa deeply affected Liliuokalani during the 3-hour visit. She knew she had to do something to help her people. When she returned home, Liliuokalani began working with the Board of Health on procuring land at Kaka'ako in Honolulu for a branch hospital for people affected by leprosy. Princess Ruth Ke'elikolani donated the land. The idea was that as many people as possible would be treated there and not have to be relocated to Kalaupapa. As we will learn in a few minutes, that's what happened. This is a map of the area of Honolulu where Kaka'ako Branch Hospital would have been located, now much farther inland because of the fill. The hospital would have been in the area now bordered by Ala Moana Boulevard and Auahi, Coral, and Keawe. Princess Liliuokalani would become personally affected by the separation of loved ones forced to go to Kalaupapa. In 1888, the princess learned that her childhood friend and fellow musician, Kapoli Kamakau, was being sent to Kalaupapa. Kapoli had been a friend not only of Liliuokalani, but also of Princess Ruth and Princess Bernice, Pauahi Bishop. This is an excerpt from Liliuokalani's diary with her words of despair when she learned that Kapoli was being sent away. Kapoli's English name or nickname was Lizzie. Just before Kapoli was sent to Kalaupapa, Princess Liliuokalani went to Kaka'ako to say goodbye to her cherished friend. The two friends would see each other just one more time. When Liliuokalani visited Kalaupapa in 1891 as the new queen, still mourning the death of her brother, Queen Liliuokalani and Kapoli had a tearful reunion before they parted. A few months later, Kapoli died. I want to again thank Kalaupapa historian Anwe Law for her meticulous research in bringing back Kapoli's important place in the history of Kalaupapa and in the history of music in Hawaii. Anwe was assisted in her research by Luella Kirkjian at the Hawaii State Archives. Without the diligence of Anwe and Luella, Kapoli would be all but forgotten. With Queen Kapiolani, King Kalakaua, and Queen Liliuokalani all making visits to Kalaupapa, and all of them genuinely concerned about the plight of people affected by leprosy, Hawaii seemed to be moving toward a plan for treating people closer to home. Kaka'ako was not just named Kaka'ako Hospital, but Kaka'ako Branch Hospital. To me, one branch indicates there will be other branches. With this newer and more humane approach to the disease, coupled with the improved conditions at Kaka'ako, because of the outstanding care by Mother Marianne and the sisters, the number of people being sent to Kalaupapa was going down drastically. 290 were sent in 1883. That was the year when the sisters arrived in November. But the following year, with the sisters now at Kaka'ako, only 100 were sent to Kalaupapa. Just 74 in 1885, and only 28 in 1886. In July of 1887, however, all that progress came to an abrupt and cruel end when a group of Western businessmen forced King Kalakaua at bayonet point to sign what became known as the Bayonet Constitution, essentially stripping the king of his powers and bringing great change to Hawaii and to Kalaupapa. According to the records we have looked at, in the 18 months before the Bayonet Constitution, just 38 people were sent to Kalaupapa. In the 18 months after the Bayonet Constitution, more than 750 people were sent. Father Damien wrote how the government was, quote, seizing people from all over the islands and sending them to Kalaupapa. In September of 1887, just weeks after the Bayonet Constitution, Damien reported he had 35 boys living in his dorms. By November of 1888, just 14 months after the Bayonet Constitution, Damien said he had 100 boys under his care and was hurriedly building more dorms to shelter them. In the aftermath of the Bayonet Constitution, Kaka'ako Branch Hospital was eventually closed by those now in power. In 1890, the population of Kalaupapa reached its highest in history, 1,213. The number of people being sent to Kalaupapa remained high in the years leading to the illegal overthrow in 1893 and the illegal annexation in 1898. Following the overthrow in 1893, the people of Kalaupapa continued to support their beloved queen and joined others in standing up for the sovereignty of Hawaii. David Kaho'eka, just 22, composed a beautiful mele to Liliuokalani in 1897 while he was living at the Baldwin Home for Boys. That same year, Kalaupapa residents organized a celebration to honor the Queen's birthday. 2 weeks after that birthday celebration for the Queen, more than 21,000 men and women across the islands signed the Ku'e petition against the annexation of Hawaii to America. We thank UH Professor Noinoi Silva for rediscovering this petition in Washington, D.C. in 1998, proof that so many of the Hawaiian people fervently opposed annexation. What came as a surprise to many, including myself, was that about 700 of these individuals who signed this petition were from Kalaupapa and Kalawao. These names show how the people of Hawaii never forgot about their fellow citizens at Kalaupapa, how they made sure the petition was carried to Kalaupapa for signatures there, just as they went to other communities on all the other islands. Government could separate people physically, but they could not separate them at the heart. This was from a panel discussion at the Maui Arts and Cultural Center a number of years ago that featured Kalaupapa descendants who had Maui connections, along with Boogie Kahili Hiva, who is on the left. Kalapana Kohlers proudly holds up the page from the Ku'e petition that contains the signature of his great-grandfather, Louis Kapi'ioho. You can also see Louis's photo in front of Kalapana. Kalapana is carrying on his family's Kalaupapa legacy. In the early 1900s, life at Kalaupapa had improved. There was a progressive-minded superintendent and an outstanding doctor, and many other leaders, among them a number of people who were there because of the disease. Kalaupapa town bustled with a fish market, a poi factory, and steam laundry, a butcher shop, a boathouse, medicated baths near the dispensary, a visitor's compound, a bandstand, and a quarter-mile circular racetrack. There were glee clubs, bands, athletic clubs, and according to one report, even debating societies. I love that. Although life was better at Kalaupapa in many ways during the early 1900s, a new policy that took effect in 1908 was, in my mind, one of the most tragic and painful in the history of Kalaupapa. This was when it became compulsory for children born at Kalaupapa to be taken from their parents at birth. A new hospital that was built at Kalaupapa in 1908 included a nursery. When children were born, they were taken from their parents and placed in this nursery. All parents could do was come to the nursery at certain times of certain days to look at their baby through a glass window. If after a number of months or a year or so, the child was still healthy, he or she would be taken out of Kalaupapa to live with relatives or with someone else selected by the parents. If no one was available to take the child, they would be admitted to an orphanage established for the children of the people of Kalaupapa. The separation of children from their parents caused unimaginable anguish and was another example of how leprosy policies tore families apart. The parents who had to give up their children at birth were often not reunited until their offspring were older, and sometimes they were never reunited at all. Even when children and parents got to know one another many years later, it was not the typical relationship most parents and children have. Some adult children of parents at Kalaupapa who are now in their 60s or older still deal with painful emotions from the separation. Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa has tried to provide opportunities for healing for these children of Kalaupapa. Medical treatment of leprosy was improving in the early 1900s. I believe much of the credit goes to Dr. William Goodhue, who was an outstanding and caring physician and surgeon who saw the residents of Kalaupapa as people, not just patients. I understand we have a descendant of Dr. Goodhue with us tonight. You should be proud. We're not sure when regular reexaminations began, but it was during this time period. According to the Maui News, some residents of Kalaupapa petitioned the territorial legislature in 1909 to be reexamined. The newspaper that reported that of the 100 people who were reexamined, 57 tested negative for the disease, 57 out of 100. There was a letter to the editor of the Hawaiian language newspaper, Kuokoa, from Kalaupapa that reported the names of each person who tested negative during this time in 1909. Reexaminations continued into the future. Those who tested negative were given the option to leave Kalaupapa. Some did leave and return to their home islands, but it seems that most people chose to remain in the settlement because it had become home. Progress was being made in the research labs as well. By 1915, a medical breakthrough at Hawaii College, which would become the University of Hawaii, gave hope to people around the world who were affected by leprosy. Alice Ball, a young African-American chemist at Hawaii College, developed this revolutionary technique that produced an injectable solution of oil from the seeds of the chalmugra tree. Her discovery greatly improved the health of so many people that it was believed that chalmugra oil was the long-awaited cure for leprosy. Until only about 20 years ago, Alice Ball had also been nearly lost to this history. She's now remembered with an annual ceremony at UH Manoa. Chalmugra oil was having such a positive impact that according to our records, it appears that no one was admitted to Kalaupapa from June of 1919 through June of 1923. People were being treated at Kalihi Hospital with the promise of getting well and being released. And there was great hope that leprosy finally meant no longer being sent to Kalaupapa for the rest of your life. It was during this time of optimism that the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act was passed by Congress in 1920. Because it was believed that leprosy was at long last curable, the entire peninsula was originally designated as Hawaiian homelands, with the thought that the days of Kalaupapa being a leprosy settlement would be coming to an end. The land would soon be open to being homesteaded by a general population of Native Hawaiians, possibly including people at Kalaupapa who no longer had the disease. However, sometime in late 1922 or early 1923, doctors noticed that many people who had been released after taking chalmugra oil were reactivating. Kalihi Hospital no longer had room for those already admitted, along with those now being readmitted. 2 large Army tents were brought in to provide shelter for the overflow. Crushing the spirits of so many, on June 8th and June 9th of 1923, ships headed to Kalaupapa for the first time in 4 years, carrying between them nearly 100 people to a life of uncertainty and leaving the public to wonder if a cure for leprosy would ever be found. A year later, changes were made to the Hawaiian Homes Land Award. Much of the peninsula was returned to the territory, but the Ahupua'a of Kalaupapa, about 1,300 acres, remained as Hawaiian homelands and still is today. Today, the National Park Service has a lease with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands for that parcel. The lease expires in 2041 and could be renewed. There were many events and people in the 1930s and 1940s that changed life at Kalaupapa. We don't have time to describe them all here, but I did want to focus on what I consider to be the 2 biggest breakthroughs of that period. The introduction of the medicine that turned out to be the miracle cure for leprosy, and the end of being forced to go to Kalaupapa. The medicine that cured leprosy, an injectable sulfone drug called Promin, was discovered at the National Leprosarium in Carville, Louisiana in 1941, and was introduced to Kalaupapa in 1946. The medicine produced dramatic and rapid improvements in many. The other major advancement in the 1940s was the end of the policies that forced people to go to Kalaupapa. This took place in November of 1949 with the opening of a residential complex called Halemohalu in Pearl City. With the success of the sulfone drugs, it was clear that the drastic separation policies were coming to an end. We often don't hear about this important policy change that happened in 1949. Halemohalu was established so anyone diagnosed with leprosy could be admitted there and begin taking the medicine and enroll in educational courses or vocational training, with the goal of being released within a few years or sooner, and then go back to their homes and their community. Halemohalu, which means house of comfort, was much more relaxing than a hospital. This is a picture from the Honolulu Advertiser in 1955 of a man packing at Halemohalu, preparing to go home. With the opening of Halemohalu, forced relocation to Kalaupapa all but ended. According to a report, it appears that just 1 person was admitted against their will. In 1953, Kalaupapa residents asked that anyone at Halemohalu be given the option to transfer to Kalaupapa. Between 1949 and 1969, records of Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa show that only 55 people were admitted there. Those who asked to be transferred to Kalaupapa had different reasons for choosing going to Kalaupapa over staying at Halemohalu. Some people went to Kalaupapa because they had family or friends there. Others chose Kalaupapa because the wide open spaces were more like where they grew up as opposed to Pearl City. And one woman told me that she felt Kalaupapa was her only option at a good life. She said even if she had been cured at Halemohalu, she did not believe that her family would accept her coming home. This is especially sad that society's ignorance could cause some people to feel they had to leave their homes forever. The government was forced to revise its policies again after Kalaupapa activist Richard Marks contacted Beacon magazine, based in Honolulu. Richard described very bluntly the injustices and archaic rules that people still had to live under there, even more than 20 years after the medicine had been introduced and when it was well known that leprosy was not nearly as contagious as once thought. Because of Richard's courage, a statewide committee was appointed to review Hawaii's leprosy laws. In 1969, it was agreed that anyone newly diagnosed with leprosy could be treated at home, not needing to be isolated in a facility away from their family. After these policies were changed, no one would need to be admitted to Kalaupapa or to Halemohalu, with very few exceptions. As you can see, Beacon Magazine named Richard its Man of the Year. The revised laws in 1969 meant that anyone diagnosed with leprosy could take the medicine at home and not have to be admitted to either Halemohalu or Kalaupapa. This was great news for people newly diagnosed with the disease. However, it took years for real change to come to the people who were already at Kalaupapa. Change did not happen overnight in 1969, as we are sometimes led to believe. After the media celebrated the change in the law, reporters followed up with trips to Kalaupapa a few months later and reported that many people at Kalaupapa said that the rules there had only changed on paper, not in the settlement. Again, we often don't hear about this part of the story. Richard Marks told the Honolulu Advertiser, "They never provide any definite answers regarding changes. They only change words and try to make everyone believe changes are taking place." Other residents made similar statements to the reporters. In fact, it took time for rules to be relaxed. So while the policy change in 1969 was certainly important, it was a step in a series of steps to loosen the rules at Kalaupapa and educate the public that leprosy was curable. It's important to keep in mind that even when laws change on paper, it sometimes takes years for human behaviors, attitudes, and policies to follow. Due to time and concern, I'm overwhelming you with dates and information. I'm just going to briefly touch on a few other occurrences since 1969. I'm hoping you will learn more about these on your own. From 1978 to 1983, residents of Kalaupapa and Halemohalu occupied Halemohalu and Pearl City when the state decided to close the facility rather than make needed repairs. Bernard Punikaya led this inspiring protest movement that rallied hundreds of people in support of the people of Halemohalu and Kalaupapa. We will be taking a closer look at the Halemohalu movement in a webinar hosted by Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa on Saturday, September 30th. Concerned that the state of Hawaii might sell the land at Kalaupapa to a developer, the people of Kalaupapa invited the National Park Service to assist them, to work with them in preserving their lifestyle, the buildings, and the history. Kalaupapa National Historical Park was established in late 1980. With Kalaupapa residents leading the way, Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa organized in 2003, bringing together family members and friends to support the Kalaupapa community. Father Damien was canonized in 2009, and Mother Marianne canonized in 2012. Many of the Kalaupapa residents attended the ceremonies in Rome for each of their saints. Since 1985, the people of Kalaupapa have wanted a memorial to make sure that everyone sent there would be remembered and honored. When Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa organized, the community asked that building a memorial be a priority. Of the nearly 8,000 people who died at Kalaupapa, only about 1,000 have graves that can be identified. So today, most descendants who visit Kalaupapa cannot find the name of their relative. The memorial will display each of the names of the nearly 8,000 people admitted to Kalaupapa, bringing them back into the history that they helped to create. Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa went to Congress, where our bill for a memorial passed both the House and the Senate, unanimously, I might add, and was signed into law by President Barack Obama. We have been working on the many permits required and the plans ever since. Last year, the state legislature appropriated $5 million to complete planning and construction of the memorial, a huge milestone for Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa. We hope to dedicate the memorial in 2025. The memorial will be located in the open space near the upper left of this photo on the long vacant grounds of the old Baldwin home. This location was chosen because it was the preferred site of the vast majority of Kalaupapa residents. You can see St. Philomena Church at the bottom of the photo. Silawama Church, which you cannot see, is to the right of St. Philomena. This is the overview of the memorial. These interlocking circles have a meaning. The upper circle represents the people of Kalaupapa, and their names will be engraved on the curved wall around it. The lower circle represents all the families who were left behind when their loved ones were sent to Kalaupapa. Where the circles come together is what Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa has always envisioned, bringing the people of Kalaupapa and their families and descendants back together. This is the ground level view of the memorial. We love these beautiful words of Ka'iolani Hess, whose parents and other relatives were at Kalaupapa, how the memorial will be the everlasting presence of all the people. Olivia Braith's quote sums up the feelings of the community perfectly. We want to see all the names. And the Ohana is in great debt and gratitude to the group G70 for doing so much, for doing these beautiful design plans and so much of the planning with us. We can't thank them enough. When our memorial design team was brainstorming the design of the memorial in Kalawao, family members wanted to build an ahu to mark the spot. This was a procession of Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa to the site of the future memorial. The procession was led by Kalaupapa residents and a lead architect of the memorial. Many thanks to all of you for your time and attention today. I want to point out that if you want to learn more, the best resource is the book, Kalaupapa, A Collective Memory by Anwe Law. All of the photographs we have used in this webinar are owned by the various archives and photographers noted. I want to especially thank Wayne Levin for his 40 years of taking pictures of the people of Kalaupapa and their families. Wayne, too, is a historian. Also, thanks to Henry Law, the first superintendent of Kalaupapa National Historical Park, and now an accomplished photographer. Before we close, I want to pay tribute to our good friend, Clarence Naya, who was born on September 17th, 1926. Naya was a committed Hawaiian rights activist who stood shoulder to shoulder with Bernard Punikaya for the entire 5.5 years of the occupation of Halemohalu after the state ordered residents to leave. Naya and Bernard and other supporters were arrested in 1983 on the day Halemohalu was raised. Naya was later a founding member of Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa. We hold him dearly in our hearts, along with all of his beloved dogs. We love you, Clarence Naya. We also have a lot of materials on our website, including information that I spoke about today. So please take a look if you haven't recently. And mahalo.
Lovely, Valerie. That was just lovely. Thank you
Has-
so much. I'm gonna, maybe Martina, you probably see that there's a few questions for Valerie.
Yep.
And before we go to the before you go to the questions, can I just remind the viewers that we have a part 2 to this presentation? We have Lekulu Vaimaka Malaysia and Kahikino Kala Domingo, and they will be presenting the second half, and that's Hawaiian language resources that reference Kalaupapa and or Hansen's disease. So over to you. Thanks for letting me get that in.
Yeah, no, great. Valerie, mahalo nui. You know, over the years, I've read so much. I have this whole little collection of books on Kalaupapa, and I learned so much that I didn't know from you tonight, which I'm sure is the situation for a lot of the people in the audience too. So, wow, what an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. And just from your heart, I really, really appreciate it. We have a couple of questions, and there may be some more coming in, but let's start. The first one that came up says, who does one contact to restore headstones of family members buried in Kalaupapa? And maybe
excuse me.
related to that too, Valerie, let me add this one. How does one coordinate visits to pay respect and show other family members where family are buried so that they continue the legacy?
So for the visits to Kalaupapa, the Ohana is just kind of getting those started again. We're probably going to gear up at the first of the year. You know, we weren't allowed to go over there during COVID. And so this last year, they've started to open up a little bit. And of course, then our Ohana van was another victim of COVID. And so we had to get another van in on the barge. But we're hoping to start up the group visits again in January. We're more limited on the number we can handle at any one time, but we're hoping as time goes on that they might relax that. So you can always email, just go to our website and you'll find how to contact us, and we'll get the, we'll receive your email. For the headstones, that would be to contact Kalaupapa National Historical Park. And so they also have a website. And so I would look for that and find a contact information.
Okay. Let me just ask him if we have any questions that have come over Facebook, our Facebook stream.
I don't see any right now, but I see an awful lot of mahalos, Valerie. So thank you for your most thorough history presentation. I love that first anecdote that you bring up with the school teacher. That's just so extraordinary. And of course, his dapper suit, it was the clincher. That's really what brought it all together. But I really love the personal stories that you wove in to the history as well.
We have so many of those, and it's all because of the families. And again, I have to say, it's because of the resurgence of the Hawaiian language. You know, it just shows us how important languages are to each culture, and how the history is told in their way. If we look at, you know, the way the language that the people were speaking. So I am just so grateful that there are so many now Hawaiian speakers and people who are reading this. And I think we're going to hear about that in the next presentation. So
one question is, are the 8,000 names posted on the Kalaupapa website, Ka'ohana Kalaupapa website?
Not yet. No, we're waiting for the memorial first.
Okay.
And then we will probably do that. In fact, that's something that we're already talking about. But yeah, we want to wait and get the memorial.
But if people have questions, if they are descendants or they have an auntie or uncle or somebody, they can call you or contact you.
Absolutely.
Information is shared freely.
And we can help with, yes. And we can help what we have found. We have, over the years, we have compiled all these records, you know, the admissions register, the death records, birth records, marriage records, census records, church minutes. So we have just a wealth of information. And of course, we also find, you know, newspaper articles in both the Hawaiian language and English language newspapers that are helpful. They can contain obituaries for people, and just, you know, other stories about life that was going on at Kalaupapa. So we have so much now that, I just think of when I first started going there, and it was pretty much all Father Damien, and that was it. And so we have now really enhanced so many people. It's certainly not just the Ohana, but we've all just enhanced how this history is being told. And we thank the people of Kalaupapa. I think of people like Bernard Punikaya and Sarah Benjamin and Helen Kao, who I considered them all to be historians, and they all were saying, the way that we hear the history, we don't think that's the way it happened. And so they knew.
Good to know.
I really appreciated that part of what you shared this evening, which was the positive, that sort of that light from that community, and that love and that caring that was there, and that it really was a community. And I think people sometimes forget about that, and I thought you really brought that to light really nicely.
Well, and it shows the power of community anywhere. And I think that's something we're losing in our society. And so, it just shows how valuable that personal contact is, and caring for one another.
I know there are probably people wondering, the relationship that Ka'ohana has with the National Park Service now that they're there, and Hawaiian Homelands is still there. So,
Yes.
Any thoughts on sort of that relationship and what that might look like?
We just try to work with everybody where we can. We don't always agree with everything, but that's with so many organizations. You might not agree with everything, but you can try to find what you have in common, and then hopefully work through there. So yeah.
Great. So
That's great. I don't think there are any more questions. So thank you so much, Valerie. And
Thank you.
yeah, we are grateful that, and we're looking forward, Ahahui ana Kauka and Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa are looking forward to working together more in the future. We're looking at presenting more information about Kalaupapa next year, in the year 2024.
Yes, and we appreciate that.
Yay. Oh, good. Well, thank you very much. I would love to introduce our next two speakers. All right. Just as a reminder for those of you, thank you for staying with us this evening. Ho'ola Week, as you know, is coordinated by Papa'ola Lokahi, the Department of Native Hawaiian Health at the Johnny Burns School of Medicine, and Ahahui ana Kauka, the Association of Native Hawaiian Physicians. We have 1 week out of the entire Hawaiian History Month, and we're grateful to the Hawaii Pono'i Coalition and all of the many good sponsors of this week. Webinar still being live streamed. Questions, please put them in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom. If you're viewing this on Facebook, please put them in the comment section, and we'll be sure to move them over and ask Maka and Kala your questions. Tonight's episode, Kalaupapa, memorializing the past and creating a future. And we're going to go way back in history now. Our presenters are Kahikino Okala Domingo and Sage Lekulu Vaimaka Malaysia. They are graduate students at the University of Hawaii. They are in the first master's cohort, double majoring in library and information studies and Olelo Hawaii. I'm very proud of them. They're also helping to build the Hawaiian Health Archive at Papa'ola Lokahi. And this is not their first presentation during Hawaiian History Month. They've been on every year so far, and they're very popular, and we hope that you won't hesitate to ask them any questions. Their expertise is in gleaning Hawaiian language newspaper and other original sources for Hawaiian thought and practice around, for us, medicine, health, and well-being. So without further delay, Lekulu Vaimaka and Kahikino Okala. Aloha nui.
Mai ka puka ana mai a kala I kumukahi a lolokua ela I luna. Kau aku I ke awa kea a hiki aku I kona molehulehu ana ka moku ka ili la o le hua. Pelina ke aloha ia oko pe ke anaina e na hoa makamaka a hoa aloha ka ohana o molokai. Aloha. I would like to begin with this leo ho'oheno to honor the people, the patients, the aina, and the places within Kalaupapa. He mele he inoa no Kalaupapa, aina kaulana puni ka honua, o ke ku kila kila hapu'u, kua hivi kaulana mokua o hino. Alo ana ni hoa au I ke kai, oni ana e ka lae a o ka ilio, kau aku ka mana'o no ho'olehua, I ka papa konane a kai ki lani. Nani ka waiho mai a waile ia, hu mai ke aloha no kalawao. Aina I ka nuku a o wai kolu, e kolu no pua o ke onaona. Ki koni lua I ka pu'u ai, kau ana ka lae I ku umaka, I ke ala ki ke I ka pali. E o mai oi kou inoa, e ka papa konane a kai ki lani. A ina ia mai ana ka puana, he mele he inoa no Kalaupapa. And this mele, written and composed by Bayview Girl, honors and venerates all these different places on this peninsula of Molokai and her experience of and her time on the settlement. And I just wanted to begin and preface this as we begin our presentation that is really going to focus on the different accounts in Hawaiian, both from mele, from narratives, stories, newspaper articles of people who have lived in Kalawao and on Molokai, and to highlight that in the midst of all these things with the Hansen's disease, Hawaiians always honored the place that they were, whether they were from there, they were not from there, as many of them are malihini to that area. So I just wanted to go ahead and introduce our presentation. No ka ma'i ho'o ka'awale ohana.
Aloha kako. Mahalo for joining us tonight. Just like Kala was mentioning, I think a major influence for us researching and preparing for this presentation was making sure that not only were we researching through Hawaiian language resources, but getting accounts from residents themselves. And so all the articles that we've pulled tonight and all the stories in the Mo'olelo that we've been looking through and learning from are essentially primary sources. It's really important to us as Hawaiian language learners, second language learners, that we're able to read these accounts in most of the patient's native language and the native language of our kupuna as well. So,
and before we begin, I just want to preface that any mistake or things that get lost in translation, they're not the faults of the authors, the composers, they're on us. And I would just like to state that because they're mana'o, it should be told correctly and accurately. So let's begin with a brief overview of what our points will be today. So we'll go over a brief timeline just to contextualize because the previous presentation had a great overview of the history of Kalaupapa and the settlement, so I won't go too much into that, but just to give a brief context to the articles that we're going to share. And then we'll talk about Molokai Aina Eha, which is a little review of the patient experience and life in the settlement on Molokai, in Kalaupapa, in Kalawao, in Waikolu, and the things that they went through. And then after that, we'll talk about and showcase just two patients who live on the settlement, Pua Ka'uahina Ka'e'e'ohina, which is it's an epithet of praise for people from Molokai who were excellent, but also it was because they were excellent athletes and runners. So they would say that they ran so fast that there would be smoke coming off of them. So that was kind of a way to poetically praise them. So we'll go over these two names you see here, as the previous presentation mentioned him, John Taylor Unea, and also another writer from the newspapers, Solomon Capella Maialoha. And finally, we'll talk about some of the stories of resilience and survival within all the things and the things that the patients had to experience and go through. They survived, and not only did they survive, they loved it and they made it their home, and they continue to show resilience throughout the 50, 60, 70, even almost a century of the the reign of the Hansen's disease over the people. So We see here in 1840 the first case of Hansen's disease, but more importantly, when the patients first start getting sent to Molokai and Kalawao, which is in 1866, and you'll see that a lot of our sources today is from the early 1900s, late 19th century, right around the overthrow and annexation time and into the territory and such. So this is about maybe a few decades after Hansen's disease has already been around. So we'll see some of the experiences of those people. So to talk about the kind of the perspective and the thoughts of the patients who were getting sent, that it wasn't something that was easy. It was traumatic and sometimes even shameful, that you don't want people to know that you had the Hansen's disease. So this kind of shows in these two meta that you see here, some of the feelings and some of the perspectives of some of the patients who were sent there. On the left was composed by J.F. Allen. On the right, it's an anonymous person who was sick. So we'll say, "Kau ia kamai veli nui ia ho'okai ho'ia ka lehulehu. Veo na maka ke ike mai, komo e ka hila hila I ka hopo." So that last line, it shows that they were kind of shameful to be sent to this place because nobody wants to be separated from their families. And in addition, nobody wants to be known as a leper or a sick person. And Happy New Year, Happy New Year. Na friends noa pauloa I ho'onoho ia e ke aupuni ma kia kapakai malihini, that the government has placed me here on this shoreline where I am a malihini too. I am not familiar. I don't know these places. I don't know these people. I don't know this area. It's just some of the insight on that. And on the mele on the right, it's a little longer one. Kaulana molokai I ina mokopuni ke kahua ho'olulu a kalepela. And I want to show one line in this mele that it is here, hiki mai ku'ukino I Kalaupapa nei, mamuli o nei hana ke aloha. And then if you go two more lines down, aloha ko leo ai e kamakua I ke kaukau mai me ka waimaka. I speak of the love of the parent to the child and the calling of the tears that roll down my cheeks. Eia ku'ukino me ka papaola, ola ma ko I ke aupuni. And here I am, my person, my body is no longer in agency of myself, but rather in the control of the Board of Health. And our lives are now in the hands of the government being sent to Kalaupapa in the settlement, to show that the way that these people felt that they no longer had control over their lives or what was going to happen. So they had to cherish the things that they knew in their lives and the things that were going to come ahead. And for you folks who understand Hawaii, you can kind of see in this mele some other points that was brought up to show the perspectives of the patients. Okay, so moving on.
Starting off in how we chose to start researching and looking for these mo'olelo within the Papakilo, within the Hawaiian language newspaper database. One thing that we learned while on this research process was a new term that described Kalaupapa, Kalawao, the settlement in Molokai and the peninsula. And we noticed that the writers during this time in the late 19th century, going into the 1900s, early 1900s, they used this term a lot, which was aina o ka eha eha. And so rather than plugging in just Kalaupapa or Kalawao to get results for our mo'olelo tupua, we found that plugging in aina o ka eha eha actually brought up more results for us to look through, and was just something interesting that we learned and that we hope can be a tool for other researchers as well.
And for those of you who don't understand Hawaiian, Aina o ka eha eha is like the land of sorrow, or the land of it could be pain, but it's more poetically. And as Lekuloi Maka was saying, the way that this term will use, as we'll see, is kind of like a bittersweet relationship, which really represents the way that the patients felt about where they live. Is that even though they call it Aina o ka eha eha, they also kind of had an endearing tone to it, as we'll see in the upcoming mo'olelo. So why do we choose New Pepa Olal Hawaii, the Hawaiian language newspapers, to glean some of these narratives from? It played an important role in the settlement. Not only was it simply how we see newspaper today, getting the news, but for many of these people, the ma'iho o ka'awale ohana, the sickness that separates families, this was one of the only ways that they could communicate with those that they left behind. And not only that, but beyond personal communication, there was also getting current events, as you do from the media, but also civic engagement with the government, that they had this thing that was a proxy for them, where in isolation, they could still support legislation, they could still voice their opinions about things that were happening in the kingdom in the Lahui, and vice versa, where their leo could be heard and their voice could be heard elsewhere. And another thing that was very important that we'll see, that pretty much a big chunk of the patients were all Hawaiian speakers, and a lot of them couldn't speak English. So this was one of their main things where they got any information from.
So we put just some examples that we were finding. So like if you recall how we were speaking about the aina o ka eha eha in the previous slide, these are examples of the irony of the meaning, the literal translation of aina o ka eha eha being what Kala was mentioning, how it's a sadness, some type of sorrow, literally pain, I guess. But the irony in that is that when we searched up aina o ka eha eha, so many of the results that came up was actually recollections and stories of happy celebrations. And so when we said we choose to focus on the resiliency of the patients and the ohana of Kalaupapa, we see at the top left, we have Ho'omana'o umi makahiki maka aina o ka eha eha. And this was an account of a party that was thrown by one of the patients in celebrating her 10th year anniversary of living at Kalaupapa. On the top right, we have a pa'ina lu'au maka aina eha eha. And that was actually one that we'll talk about, but this pa'ina that they had was said to have been attended by up to 500 people. And what they were celebrating was half of those 500 people were actually going to be leaving Kalaupapa and they're cleared for a release. This was shortly after some of the cures that Ms. Monson was speaking about after it came out, and half of those 500 members would be choosing to stay there or weren't allowed to be released yet. We have Pa'ina Lahanau, we have birthday parties, lots of recounts of birthday parties, Nale'aleo Makahiki Ho, New Year's parties, all the holiday parties. And then this one was really neat because I didn't actually know before reading this article, Pa'ina Lu'au Kalaupapa Glee Club. And so it was really neat in learning to see how the town grew into so many different organizations. So the Glee clubs, they had a Boy and Girl Scout club and troops. And so this juxtaposition of calling it the Aina o ka eha eha, but then seeing all these recounts and mo'olelo of really celebratory and happy times shows the resilience and shows the aloha that the patients had for this aina that they were malihini to at first when they got here. None of them were from this place, but they truly made the best of it and became, they grew a true love for this aina.
And back to one of the names for the Hansen's disease, which was the ma'iho o ka'awale ohana, or the sickness that separates families. Something else that we see about this relationship of ka'aina, this endearment, was that even though this sickness was what separated them from their families, here in Kalaupapa, it's evident to see by all these different kinds of celebrations, not only did they make the best of the situation, but they found a new family. You know, they found fellowship and camaraderie in this settlement, and they made the best of what they had, and they were resilient and they survived and even thrived, you know. So it's just to show that perspective. So let me talk briefly about this one here, Pa'ina Lu'au Maka'aina Eha Eha. So it was written by someone that we'll talk about more later. His name was Solomon Capella Maialoha, but he was originally from Kohala in Ainakea. He was a school teacher there, and he couldn't speak much English, but he was one of the writers that would often write stories to Kalaupapa Ku'oko'a, one of the biggest Hawaiian language newspapers with a huge Hawaiian language readership. He would write all these different stories into this newspaper, but he wouldn't focus on the negative and the tragedy and the hardship. But as you see here, just in the title, he talks about the celebration and all these amazing things that are happening. And even though half of these folks were being released, think about it, the other half, they definitely didn't have this type of resentment towards them because they joined in the celebration. They had their tables filled with all these different delicacies grown from the yards of the patients. They had music, they had dancing, they had glee clubs, they had a brass band, pila, all the different kinds of music and enjoyment. And Mr. Maialoha, he accounts all of these different people who received rounds of applause for their different acts, their different entertainments for these people who were going to be released. So just to show further evidence that there was great celebration within the settlement, and it wasn't all tragedy. So let's continue on one more slide to this Olelo No'eo here. As I said earlier, this is an epithet of praise for someone from Molokai, from Molokai Nui Ahina, comparing a praise of a person from Molokai to an athlete who could run so fast that smoke would come off of them, but it was poetic in that way. So, and we chose this title to showcase some of the people who were instrumental in keeping the morale up, communication between the outside world through Nupepa Olala Hawaii, through the newspapers. And I'll let Nikulu Maka talk about Mr. Maialoha.
So Kolamana Maialoha was one of the first ones that we noticed when we were going through the results of Aina Oka Eha'aha. We noticed, oh, Mr. Maialoha, he rode into the Nupepa a lot and became a huge informant of Kalaupapa to everyone outside. And when we kind of touched on this earlier, but the functionality the newspapers gave to the patients of Kalaupapa, a lot of times when we hear stories about Kalaupapa and Kalawao and that peninsula, we hear a lot about how isolated it is. We hear about the stories of how they had to get on the moku to get there, how they had very little to no contact, or if you're hiking down, how far that took. And then when we see all the accounts in the newspapers of the people of Kalaupapa, it gives you an appreciation because through the Nupepa, you don't really see that isolation anymore. The Nupepa is being circulated all around the Pai'aina, and this is the vessel that family members are able to check in on their ohana there. And so Mr. Maialoha and also has a pen name of Nahau o Wailea here. And Waileia we had mentioned in the mele earlier that Kala opened up with in the Velina. But this was just one of the many, many accounts that Mr. Maialoha wrote into the newspaper about. But in this article he published in 1909, he accounted for the 133 people that he knew in Kalaupapa at that time. And so if you look, there's the name. So if you start from like the left picture, there's P Kiha, and then parentheses K for Kane, and the other ones is parentheses W for Wahine. On some of the names, there's a number after it. And Mr. Maialoha clarifies before that the number stands for the amount of years that these patients were living in Kalaupapa. And so at the beginning of this article, Mr. Maialoha writes about how he wanted to account for all these people, for the ohana of all these patients living outside, to have this documented. And so this isn't actually the only one he published as well. He writes at the end of this, oh, this isn't everyone that I've gotten to get through yet, but next week I'll submit more. And when we think about even that, the amount of time that he was submitting articles, we also think about the money that Mr. Maihaloha had to pay as well, because even today, it's not cheap to publish anything in the newspapers. And back then wasn't cheap as well. And so you know that this was something that Mr. Maihaloha was deeply committed to because of the, not just the time, but the money and the detail of accounts that he went into. It feels like he never wanted to leave anyone out. He was constantly recording, constantly submitting, and to see all of these in the Hawaiian language newspapers, in the Hawaiian language, we emphasize the primary sources, we emphasize getting information from people who are there. Kala and I were not, we disclaimed at the beginning, if anything is at fault, it's our fault, because we get to learn these specifically from the Wai'ele'ele, from the ink of the newspapers. We're not learning this information from oral history or accounts of people who were there, but rather we get to trust this reliable source of someone who was there and put our trust and aloha in that.
And it's not here on the screen, but as Lekulue Maka was saying, the way that Mr. Maialoha talks about the way that he wrote down these names, it really was evidence that the settlement was a close-knit community and he knew all these people. If you think about it, did he really have time to go and interview every person, write down the information, talk with them, how many years? Because he was such a figure in the community and a proxy to the newspapers, along with John Unea, he knew all these people. He knew them by name. He knew how many years they were there, et cetera, et cetera. So, and let's continue on one more slide. And we come back to Mr. Unea, and he has a very tragic story, but also it shows that he was a very resilient man. So he was actually from Hilo in Papa'i Cove, and his 16-year-old son was actually the patient, and he left his wife and his daughter to one of his very good friends, and he and his son, he went to support him as a kokua, as his assistant to Kalaupapa. And this was in 1893. So this is John Unea Sr. and John Unea Jr. So actually 5 or 6 years after they arrive, John Unea Jr. actually passes away from Hansen's disease. And he was only 21 years old. So you can understand that the father was devastated, right? But as evidence, he went on to serve his community as the agent for Kalaupapa Ku'oko'a, one of the biggest Hawaiian language newspapers. He was the proxy for them. And the purpose of the agent was, they had many different agents all across the and across the islands. And the responsibility of the agent was to collect the fees and taxes and to get the subscribership of all the people. And they're responsible for keeping the ledgers and the accounting all accurate. And actually, Kalaupapa Ku'oko'a themselves, you see here in the bottom, praises him as his tenureship as the agent of Kalaupapa Ku'oko'a ends after he actually sent in his resignation, because in 1919, shortly before he passed away at 68 years old, he was beginning to lose his vision and almost becoming blind. So he could no longer hold his pen to scribe down all the mo'olelo, all the subscribership and information. So he sent in his resignation. But Solomon Hanohano, who was the editor of the newspaper at the time, he praised Mr. Unea, as you see here. So I'll just read a small excerpt of it. He kaka ika hiloa na akena o kia newspaper I like ho I me ko Mr. Unea ano. Maka lave ana I kana mauhana o kana I nau ho akaka a pau ke ho'ouna mai I kia ke ana. A ole he pohihihi iki. He ho akaka ana oia I ka manawa o ka ho'oka'a ana a ke la me ke ia mea lave newspaper. E ho a ko'a ana I ka po'e lave ho a me ka po'e ka hiko. Pela ho I ka po'e I waiho mai ko la ko lave ana I ka pepa. A me ka lehu e ae. E ho ike mai ana I kona ano na a wao, ka maka ala me ka maka kau. A I ho ike no ka nui o ko mako ma ke'e a me ka mina iaia. E ho o una mau I aku ana kana newspaper Ku'oko'a ahiki kona maula hope makahonua nei. A very beautiful praise of Mr. Unea when he sends in his resignation to the newspaper. So briefly, what they say is that in everything he did in service as his agent, there was nothing that was ever unclear. Everything was very detailed and always accurate. The times and the delivery and the routes of the paper boys, the subscriberships, the ledger keeping, the accounting, everything. They say here, e ho'ike mai ana I kona ano na awao ka makaala me ka makakau. His excellence, his enlightenment, his knowledge, and his dedication to his work. And it shows that in this resignation of him leaving 20 years in service, the people here, they're really going to miss him, and it's not going to be the same without him. And Solomon Hanohano at the end, he sends his regards to Mr. Unea for all his years of service, that he will keep receiving his copy of the newspaper free of fee all the way until his last days. So it showed that he really serviced his community after the tragedy that happened to him. He lost his son. He had to leave his wife and daughter behind, and he continued to serve. This is just one of the many occupations that he held. As Ms. Monson said earlier, he was also the shopkeeper, and he was also the school teacher, as we saw in that photo from earlier. But I believe personally that this is one of his most important duties that he carried out to his community. So that is Mr. John Taylor Unea.
We just wanted to actually touch briefly back on Mr. Maialoha, and something that we found that was kind of funny to us was there had to be a clarification from one of the newspaper editors on Mr. Maialoha, because there was another Solomon Maialoha that was writing into English newspapers at the time, and people were starting to get them confused. They just so happened to have the same name, but it wasn't the same person. And so the editor of the newspaper writes in to say, oh, I know Mr. Kolomoana Maialoha isn't the person that's writing into the English. He's not the informant for the English newspapers. And I know this because Mr. Maialoha doesn't speak English. And we just wanted to highlight that because it's just one of the many things, one of the many benefits when we go through the Hawaiian language newspapers and we look at these primary accounts. You know, we don't know if that newspaper editor was telling the truth. Maybe it wasn't, but it's something that we can take into consideration as researchers when we get to see everything put together and maximizing your resources in order to get a bigger picture of the mo'olelo.
So we just wanted to take that time to honor some of these I don't want to say heroes, but perhaps we could call them heroes, but me'e, people who are centers of the community that within isolation of the colony, of the settlement, it was people like Mr. Unea and Mr. Maialoha that the voices of the patients were heard throughout the Pai'aina. Their concerns were heard, and vice versa. So we just wanted to close with this article written by an anonymous person who had the Hansen's disease.
And so the context of this article was this Ma'ila Pera, the pen name of this person, was writing about news about Robert Wilcox Wilikoki, the LLA to the Senate in Washington, D.C. And the news he came back with was they're getting ready to pass some bills about how you needed to become separate from the Ohana, the Ma'i Ka'avale Ohana. And, you know, a husband had to separate from his wife to go to Kalaupapa, or you weren't allowed to stay with Ohana anymore if you had this sickness. And so this writer writes in here, "Olelo ia o hiki na mea pau ke hana ia ke dala a ka e ka hui o keia ho'okahi ka mea I koe a ore hiki ke dala ke hana o e kumalama ana I ka ma'ile pera I kona wā ino loa. He ho'okahi wai no mi a hiki ke malama o ke aloha. O ke aloha I loko ke kane no ko hine, o ko hine ho'i ke kane, o ko moko I ke keiki. O ia wale no ka mea nana I kona mai ho manawa nui na ino a pau. Ai malama ho'i me ke aloha hiki mai ka hopena. And so They're writing because, so what this translates to in context is that people are asking, how can I help? What can we do if we're going to be separated from our families? You know, if this is what the law is going to be, if this is the case, what am I going to do to help my ohana? And so the answer that seemed common back then, or that this writer is saying, is lots of people are saying, oh, the way you can help your family is you can send stuff to them. You can send money. Kadala. You know, that's how you can help them. Send money to Kalaupapa, send money to Kalawao. And when your ohana goes, that's how you can support them. And this writer, Maila Pera, is saying, you know, even though people are saying, oh, send the dollar, send money, the only thing that you can do, or the most important thing, the one thing that you can do to kakō your family at this time is aloha. You know, the aloha between iloko ke kanu no kohine, the aloha between a husband to his wife, the aloha from a wife to her husband, the aloha kumakua ke keiki from a parent to a child. That's the only thing that will bring patience, that will bring support.
That would brave the storm.
Ina inoapau, through all the bad things in life, it's the aloha that's going to get you ahiki mai ka hopena to the end. And that aloha for your ohana, that aloha that you have for each other is far above ke kala, far above money, far above all these outside things. But okay, aloha kai oiae, that will get you to the end. And that's what's going to help you persevere. And that's the resilience that we see in all these stories. At the end of the day, it's aloha.
Mm-hmm. And we wanted to leave you with this thought that, how, like we say today, money can't buy happiness. Money can't solve everything. Money can't solve our problems. The government can put in as many bills as they want. They can put as much budgeting, so much funds to fix this and to fix that. But within all of these things, this trauma that was happening, the one thing that will brave the storm, the one thing that will truly help us to the end of our days is what is aloha. And with that, Manao, we would like to leave you with that today to showcase this mo'olelo of Kalaupapa, the patience, and all of the stories and narratives that within the tragedy and trauma, aloha, oia ka mea nui. Mahalo.
Mahalo nui to you both. I love that close, that more really the moral of the story. There we go. Is aloha. Thank you so much for your research. It's interesting how Valerie had one perspective of John Unea, and then you have a different story, but definitely complementary of the same person, of the same man. So I really love how your research really enriches all of our understanding of what it was like there in Kalawao, in Kalaupapa. There's a lot of mahalos here, but I have a very academic question that has come in, and maybe you see it also. Mahalo for all of this noi'i. I have a question. The Aino Ka'eha search term has proven very useful, as you mentioned. Of the stories about Aino Ka'eha, they were happy stories you told us. Do you think that this is an expression? Do you think that this expression is informed by Hawaiian kuanaike? Or rather, it was developed from a journalism standpoint where the Aino Ka'eha was leveraged against happy stories to create journalistic intrigue?
Oh, mahalo manako no ke lani no mekai. Our fellow Kawehuelani, Aumana Manako Tanaka. Mahalo for that question. You want to go or you want me? Okay, so that's a very good question. I think it was both. Where, oh yeah, I stop my sharing so we can see mahalo. Okay, how's that? Okay, good. So I think that it all comes back to how Hawaiians would name things. And Aina Ka'eha, I think part of it was they wanted people to remember. They didn't want people to forget within these within this journalism about parties and luau and celebrations and birthdays, that this is a land of suffering. It is. It's a land that where we experience pain and sorrow, but here we are using this name, this Inoa, alongside our celebrations as a term of endearment and perhaps acceptance of the trauma that has become of us. So I do think that there is that kuana ike, if you will, of naming, where once you name something, it sticks. And that's what it represents to us, to the lahui, to the broader public. And yes, it was also to send a message. But as we see the tone of these articles, there was a term of endearment, bittersweetness, that we make the best of our situation, even though we were separated from our ohana, the ma'i ho'oka'awale ohana. We found a new ohana here in Kalaupapa, in our settlement. We may never return to our homelands, the place where we know our kulaiwi, where either our placentas were buried, but we find peace and solace and pride, perhaps, in our new homeland, our new kulaiwi, perhaps, because this is where our bones are going to rest, as we've seen today, with the story about the memorial. This is in a way, a new kulaiwi for all the patients who had passed in and are resting there. So mahalo manako for that, Nina. You have anything to add?
No, I think you explained it good.
Oh, it's a big question though.
It was a big question. I agree. Thank you for taking that. There you go. And then she mahalos you as well.
There's
Yeah.
another question. It says, I noticed some of what you chose to share had a beautiful rhythm to it. Were any ever set to melody?
Oh, that's a good question. Not
Not that I know
Yeah.
of, not that we know of, but I know lots of melee practitioners people that are able to set leo, to set melody lines, to set rhythm, or to melee found in newspapers. I'm not someone who can do it, but I have heard people who speak of it. There always is a nice rhythm. The haku mele, the person who's writing the mele, that just shows their skills and how ready they are to write the mele.
And I think even within that, there is a certain ethical standpoint from it, where if we don't know the melody, maybe we shouldn't revive it if we don't have that proficiency. But however, I feel that, through other venues besides performance, these mele can live on. They may not be living on in the way they intended necessarily, a certain melody or voice. But when we look at the lyrics, because Hawaiian mele are about the lyrics, Hawaiian mele are about the words, the intentions of the haku mele, they can live on through things like this, I think. So there's that contrast where, yeah, we could, but to my knowledge, I don't think that certain mele has been set to a melody, but I know probably somebody out there can correct me for that. Mahalo for that question.
That's a good question. Yeah. Thank you so much. I don't know if any questions have come in. Oh, very good. So Kathy is my colleague at Papololokahi. It's most important that the words live on. And I think the fact that you've had a chance to dig them up and present them publicly and to be archived, others will hear this presentation as well. I think that in that way, the words do live on.
And sorry, I didn't mention it before when I was reciting the mele, but I just wanted to mahalo my ohana and friends on Molokai, who actually I had the privilege of being with them and touring these places and seeing them with my own eyes. It was a once in a lifetime experience, and I want to mahalo them. They know who they are, but it's different when you can read a mele like this and you've seen and you've been to the places. So it makes sense in a way when you see it. So yeah. Mahalo.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. If there are any more questions, now's the opportunity. Oh, are there any links to resources where people can learn more, can do the kind of research that you're doing or that you want to promote perhaps? What are the language resources that you use?
There you go. That's a good question. It's a tricky one, but I think that so a lot of these newspaper articles, or most of all, if not all of them, are from Papakilo database, from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. But it does take a certain proficiency of Hawaiian to be able to browse it. However, there are many articles written, especially one that was brought up today by Miss Monson by Kuma Nonoi Silva, Dr. Nonoi Silva. She highlights a lot of the personal narratives and accounts of the patients that were written in Hawaiian from the newspapers. And she has some of them not necessarily translated, but she explains and she analyzes them in English. So that's one resource. I can't think off the top of my head what the name of the article is, but it's co-written by Noni Silva and one other author. So that's one resource that can be a starting point. And something I always say to people who they're not confident in their language ability is you can find resources like this, and oftentimes they can be translated, or a scholar has analyzed what the meaning is. And you can always reach out to someone that you may know to ask you to help. But yeah, that's a long answer to a short question. But anything to add? Yeah, but that's why Olelo is important, and everyone should learn, whether it's basic conversational all the way to high-level Hawaiian language research. I think everyone should try their hand at learning Olelo because it's a language that a kupuna spoke and that they thought in and that they express their thoughts in. So.
And you will find articles about your kupuna in the newspapers written in Hawaiian. I know I have, and have had them translated and found them to be quite fascinating.
Oh, and also support the work of people who do translation, because when we support them, then we can get more access to Olelo Hawaii. So.
Yep. Yep. Oh, beautiful. Wonderful presentation. You bring honor and integrity to the descendants of Kalaupapa. That's from a viewer on YouTube. Mahalo. Well, thank you. I think this is really a complimentary presentation about the life and legacy of Kalaupapa with Ka'ohana o Kalaupapa presented by Valerie Monson, and the deep research that you've done. I think there's just so much more for us to learn. And maybe during next year, 2024, we're kind of partnering, these 3 Hawaiian health organizations are partnering to share more information about Kalaupapa next calendar year. So we look forward to more. Thank you. Le Kulufai Maka Malaysia and Kaikino Kala Domingo. Maka and Kala are my colleagues at Papa Ololokahi and graduate students, and I'm always proud to be able to present all the smarts that they have to the greater public, to the greater community. So mahalo nui. And to Martina, my partner in planning and coordination for the Ho'ola Week for Hawaiian History Month. So mahalo nui for these presentations. We're very grateful, and I hope you'll stay on a little bit afterwards. Mahalo to the panelists, Maka, Kala, to Valerie, to all of our sponsors, Kamehameha Schools, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Iolani Palace, Kanaiokana, Lili'u Okalani Trust, Papa Ololokahi, the University of Hawaii Johnny Burns School of Medicine's Department of Native Hawaiian Health, to Ahahui o Nakauka, the Center for Biographical Research at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, Hawaii Youth Opera Chorus, Olelo Community Media, and Oiwi TV. Mahalo, Courtney, and mahalo, Lauren, for making sure everything ran smoothly tonight. Mahalo to all of our many partners who shared this and who are part of the Hawaiian History Month Ohana. Next week, Hana Keaka is being presented in person at Kennedy Theater at the University of Hawaii. You can register at the Hawaiian History Month website, and then the presentation will also be shared online at a later date. And mahalo nui, you can find more information about Hawaiian History Month on Hawaii Ponoi's Facebook page, Instagram page, and of course on the website where this presentation will be archived, where you can register for other presentations, both in person and online. So mahalo nui on behalf of Hawaii Pono'i Coalition and Hawaiian History Month. It's our pleasure to bring you Hawaiian health. E ola mau. Aloha.